This lecture is on Chapter 17, the Endocrine System. What is the endocrine system? The endocrine system is a group of interacting glands and tissues that produce and secrete chemical signals called hormones to initiate and maintain body functions. The endocrine system coordinates and integrates activities of body cells. It also influences metabolic activities, and the responses are slower but longer lasting than the nervous system. The endocrine system and nervous system are similar yet different. Both systems rely on the release of chemicals that bind to specific receptors on their target cells. Both share many chemical messengers. When released into the bloodstream, they are called hormones, but when released into a synapse, they're called neurotransmitters. Both systems are regulated primarily by negative feedback control, and both share a common goal: to preserve homeostasis by coordinating and regulating the activities of other cells, tissues, organs, and systems. The organs or glands of the endocrine system include the pineal gland, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, thymus, adrenal glands, pancreas, and then the ovary for females and testes for males. Hormone signaling involves 3 stages. Stage 1, the reception of the signal occurs when a hormone binds to a specific receptor protein on or in the target cell. Step 2, signal transduction converts the signal from one form to another. And then stage 3, response is a change in the cell's behavior. Hormones are either lipid-soluble or water-soluble. A lipid-soluble hormone binds to an intracellular receptor because it can pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. A steroid hormone directly initiates the production of proteins within the target cell. Steroid hormones easily diffuse through the cell membrane. The hormone binds to its receptor in the cytosol, forming a receptor hormone complex. The receptor hormone complex then enters the nucleus and binds to the target gene on the DNA. Transcription of the gene creates a messenger RNA that is translated into the desired protein within the cytoplasm. A water-soluble hormone binds to a plasma membrane receptor. It cannot pass directly through the plasma membrane. Water-soluble hormones cannot diffuse through the cell membrane. These hormones must bind to a surface cell membrane receptor. The receptor then initiates a cell signaling pathway within the cell involving G proteins, adenylyl cyclase, a secondary messenger cyclic AMP, abbreviated CAMP, and protein kinases. In the final step, these protein kinases phosphorylate proteins in the cytoplasm. This activates proteins in the cell that carry out the changes specified by the hormone. Let's look at these one more time. For the lipid-soluble hormones, you can see step 1, the lipid-soluble hormone diffuses directly through the plasma membrane. In step 2, the hormone binds with a receptor in the cytoplasm, and this forms a receptor hormone complex. In step 3, receptor hormone complex enters the nucleus and triggers gene transcription. Step 4, the transcribed messenger RNA is translated into proteins that alter cell activity. Recall that transcription occurs in the nucleus, and that is when an mRNA molecule is formed. The mRNA can leave the nucleus and go into the cytoplasm, where it's carrying the genetic information. Once in the cytoplasm, the mRNA can dock onto a ribosome, and in the process of translation, tRNA molecules will bring amino acids that correspond to the codons of the mRNA molecule. And the building of the polypeptide chains consist of amino acids, which will then be modified for use. For water-soluble hormones, in step 1, water-soluble hormones are membrane insoluble. They have to bind to a receptor. They can't go straight through the membrane. In step 2, the G protein will be activated by the binding of this hormone. In step 3, the G protein will activate the adenylyl cyclase molecule, which will then, in step 4, catalyze the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP, which is the secondary messenger in this pathway. In step 5, cyclic AMP will activate protein kinases. And in 6, protein kinases, which are enzymes, phosphorylate proteins in the cytoplasm. This means that they add phosphate molecules or phosphate ions to the proteins within the cytoplasm, and this activates the proteins, allowing them to alter cell activity. Some endocrine glands, such as the thyroid, primarily secrete hormones into the blood. Other glands, such as the pancreas, have endocrine and non-endocrine functions. Other organs, such as the stomach and heart, are primarily non-endocrine, but have some cells that secrete hormones. Let's take a look at the major endocrine glands and their hormones. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which regulates biological rhythms. The hypothalamus contains produces multiple hormones that control the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is composed of the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Within the anterior pituitary, it produces multiple hormones that affect other endocrine glands and cells. Within the posterior pituitary, it produces oxytocin, which stimulates mammary gland cells and the contraction of the uterus. It also produces antidiuretic hormone, which promotes retention of water by the kidneys. The thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormone, which affects the metabolic processes. It also secretes calcitonin, which lowers blood calcium. Parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, which raises blood calcium. The adrenal glands are found on top of the kidneys, and they include the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. Within the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced. Both will raise blood glucose level, increase metabolic activities, and constrict certain blood vessels. Within the adrenal cortex, glucocorticoids are secreted, which will raise blood glucose levels. Mineralocorticoids increase blood volume and pressure. The pancreas has the endocrine function of producing insulin, which lowers blood glucose. It also produces glucagon, which will raise blood glucose. In males, the testes will produce androgens, which support sperm formation and the secondary sex characteristic development. In females, ovaries produce estrogen that stimulate uterine lining growth and the development of female secondary sex characteristics. Progesterone promotes uterine lining growth. Let's go through each of the endocrine organs in a little more detail, starting with the hypothalamus. We start with the hypothalamus because it is the main control center of the endocrine system. It receives information from nerves about the external environment and the internal condition of the body. It responds by sending out the appropriate nervous or endocrine signals and directly controls the pituitary gland, which in turn secretes hormones that influence numerous body functions. The hypothalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, is important in regulating the pituitary gland. Recall that the pituitary gland is divided into the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Let's take a look at the anterior pituitary gland. In number 1, the neurosecretory cells produce hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones. These hormones are secreted into a portal system. Each type of hypothalamic hormone either stimulates or inhibits production and secretion of an anterior pituitary hormone. Step 4, the anterior pituitary secretes its hormones into the bloodstream, which delivers them to specific cells, tissues, and glands. Examples here are the thyroid-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which goes to the adrenal cortex, the mammary glands, which stimulate prolactin, bones and tissues. Growth hormone is stimulated for these tissues to grow. And then in the ovaries and the testes, the gonadotrophic hormones are stimulated, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. In the posterior pituitary gland, it is communicated with by neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. These neurosecretory cells produce ADH and oxytocin. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. And these hormones move down the axons to the axon terminals into the posterior pituitary. And when appropriate, ADH and oxytocin are secreted from axon terminals into the bloodstream. So the kidney tubules and the blood vessels will respond to the antidiuretic hormone that helps to retain water. The smooth muscle in the uterus will react to oxytocin, which will cause contractions during labor, and the mammary glands will respond to oxytocin, which will stimulate lactation. So let's look at the pituitary gland in a little more detail. The two major lobes are the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe. The posterior pituitary stores those two hormones mentioned previously, the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. Note that the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin are both made by the hypothalamus. So again, looking at this illustration, we see that in step 1, the hypothalamic neurons synthesize oxytocin and ADH. In step 2, oxytocin and ADH are transported along hypothalamic hypophyseal tract to the posterior pituitary gland. In step 3, oxytocin and ADH are stored in axon terminals in the posterior pituitary gland. And in step 4, oxytocin and ADH are released into the blood when hypothalamic neurons fire. Another cool thing about oxytocin is it stimulates bonding between mothers and children, fathers and children, between siblings, and members of your crew, if you would, your tribe, your people. And it even stimulates bonding between you and your pets. Now let's look at the anterior pituitary hormones. We've got growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. So in step 1 for the anterior pituitary, when appropriately stimulated, hypothalamic neurons secrete releasing and inhibiting hormones into the primary capillary plexus. Plexus means a network. See how these are networks? In step 2, hypothalamic hormones travel through the portal veins to the anterior pituitary, where they stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. In step 3, anterior pituitary hormones are secreted into the secondary capillary plexus. This table is a review of the endocrine glands and the hormones released and their functions. So let's take a look. So the hypothalamus, the hormone released is the hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting hormones. It regulates the anterior pituitary hormones. Hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus but released from the posterior pituitary include the antidiuretic, or ADH, and oxytocin. Antidiuretic is going to target the tissues or the kidneys, and it will stimulate water reabsorption. by kidneys and blood vessel constriction. The oxytocin produced by the posterior or by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary is going to stimulate the uterus and mammary glands. It will stimulate uterine muscle contraction and the release of milk by the mammary glands. Now let's look at the part of the table that describes what the anterior pituitary secretes. So the first one is thyroid stimulating hormone, and it is going to target the thyroid, and it will stimulate the thyroid gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to target the adrenal cortex, and it will stimulate the adrenal cortex. The follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones are going to target the gonads, and they will influence egg and sperm production as well as sex hormone production. Prolactin will target the mammary glands and will stimulate milk production. Growth hormone will target soft tissues and bones and will stimulate cell division, protein synthesis, and the bone growth. Melanocyte stimulating hormone will target melanocytes in the skin. It says it has unknown functions in humans, but it regulates skin color in the lower vertebrates. I do know that our skin color is influenced by melanin. Okay, so that is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the thyroid gland is located in the neck just under the larynx, which is known as the voice box. Thyroid hormones regulate many aspects of metabolism, reproduction, and development. The thyroid gland consists of two lobes connected by an isthmus, and it has follicles and parafollicular cells. So within the follicles, the follicle cells produce thyroglobulin. The central cavity stores colloid, which consists of iodinated thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is combined with iodide ions absorbed from the diet to form the thyroid hormones T3, triiodothyronine, and T4, thyroxine. The parafollicular cells will produce calcitonin. The thyroid gland is located in the neck where it wraps around the trachea. A, which would be the top view, is the anterior view of the thyroid gland. B would be the posterior, it's that middle view here, posterior view of the thyroid gland. And then C is the bottom image, and it is the glandular tissue composed primarily of thyroid follicles. The larger parafollicular cells often appear within the matrix of follicle cells. Thyroid hormone is a major metabolic hormone. It increases the metabolic rate and heat production. It plays a role in the maintenance of blood pressure, the regulation of tissue growth, the development of skeletal and nervous systems, and reproductive capabilities. Calcitonin is a hormone secreted by the thyroid and lowers blood calcium levels. It antagonizes the effects of parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin inhibits osteoclast activity. It inhibits bone resorption, and it inhibits the release of calcium from the bony matrix. Instead, it stimulates calcium uptake into the bone. The parathyroid glands are located in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. Chief cells will secrete the parathyroid hormone, and it stimulates osteoclast activity. It stimulates the release of calcium into the blood. It enhances the reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys, and it promotes the activation of vitamin D to the active form vitamin D3. This illustration shows the parathyroid glands located posterior of the thyroid. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels when they drop too low. Conversely, calcitonin, which is released from the thyroid gland, decreases blood calcium levels when they become too high. These two mechanisms constantly maintain blood calcium concentration at homeostasis. If we look further, we can see here the stimulus is that blood calcium concentration drops. This causes the release of parathyroid hormone. Chief cells of the parathyroid gland release parathyroid hormone. The effects of parathyroid hormone on the bone is to inhibit the osteoblasts and stimulates the osteoclasts. Thus, the osteoclasts will break the bone down and release calcium ions into the bloodstream. The effects of parathyroid hormone on the kidneys. It stimulates the kidney tubule cells to recover calcium ions from the urine, and it stimulates kidney tubule cells to release calcitriol. The effect of the calcitriol on the intestine is to stimulate the intestines to absorb calcium from the digesting food. So please note that calcitriol is the vitamin D3, the active form of vitamin D. Then the blood calcium levels will increase. If the calcium levels increase above homeostasis, as in step 5, high concentrations of calcium stimulate parafollicular cells in the thyroid to release calcitonin. The effects of calcitonin on the bone is to stimulate the osteoblasts so that they will bring the calcium from the blood into the bone. So we're going to deposit bone. It will inhibit osteoclasts, so we're not breaking bone down anymore. And then calcium is removed from the blood and used to build bone. So this cycle will continue as long as it maintains homeostasis. Unfortunately, a lot of us are deficient in calcium, and so our blood calcium levels are generally low. And this is going to be what usually happens then. The parathyroid hormones are going to constantly be stimulating the osteoclasts to remove the calcium from the bone and deposit it into the bloodstream. And this can cause the weakening of our bones over time. Calcium is necessary for nerve impulses, muscle contraction, and blood clotting. So thyroid imbalance can cause disease. Hyperthyroidism leads to high blood pressure, a loss of weight, overeating, and irritability. Hypothyroidism leads to low blood pressure, being overweight, and often feeling cold and lethargic. Iodine deficiency can produce a goiter, which is an enlargement of the thyroid. It's a positive feedback mechanism in which the thyroid continues to try to make the thyroid hormone, but it cannot because it doesn't have the iodine. And so the enlargement of the thyroid is seen here in this illustration as a goiter. All right, so to recap, the endocrine gland here in this table is the thyroid, and we see that it can release thyroxine, known as T4, and triiodothyronine, which is T3. It targets all tissues and increases metabolic rate, regulates growth and development. Also from the thyroid is calcitonin release, and this targets bones, kidneys, and the intestines, and it lowers blood calcium levels because it puts the calcium into the bones. That's what calcitonin does. And then the parathyroid glands are going to secrete parathyroid hormone, which targets the bones, kidneys, and the intestines as well, but it raises blood calcium level because it stimulates the osteoclasts to remove calcium from the bone and put it into the blood. The adrenal glands are pyramid-shaped glands perched on top of the kidneys. They consist of the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. This illustration shows that the cortex lines the outside of the gland and the medulla is on the interior. The entire gland is surrounded by a capsule of connective tissue. Both adrenal glands sit atop the kidneys and are composed of an outer cortex and an inner medulla, all surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. The cortex can be subdivided into additional zones, all of which produce different types of hormones. In the cortex, we see the zona glomerulosa, which releases mineralocorticoids such as aldosterone, and these regulate mineral balance. The zona fasciculata will release glucocorticoids, and the examples are cortisol, corticosteroid, and cortisone, and they regulate glucose metabolism. The zona reticularis is going to release androgens such as dehydroepiandrosterone, and these stimulate masculinization. And then the adrenal medulla will release stress hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will stimulate the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. In summary, the hormones of the adrenal cortex are corticosteroids, mineralocorticosteroids, and glucocorticoids. Hormones of the adrenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine. This table shows how the adrenal glands release these hormones. In the stress response, the short-term effect will be caused by epinephrine and norepinephrine. And this will increase heartbeat and blood pressure, will cause blood glucose levels to rise. Also, respiration rate and blood flow to skeletal muscles will increase, as will the pupils dilate. The long-term stress response is caused by the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids released by the cortex. Glucocorticoids will stimulate protein and fat metabolism instead of carbohydrate breakdown. It will stimulate the reduction of inflammation and the suppression of the immune system cells. Mineralocorticoids will cause sodium ions and water to be reabsorbed by the kidney, will also increase blood volume and pressure. So here's the table that summarizes these hormones. So the first three are from the adrenal cortex, and they include the glucocorticoids such as cortisol. It targets all tissues, raises blood glucose level, and stimulates the breakdown of proteins and fats. Mineralocorticoids like aldosterone will target the kidneys and stimulate the reabsorption of sodium as well as the excretion of potassium. Sex hormones will be released and target the gonads, the skin, the muscles, and the bones, and stimulate reproductive organs and bring about sex characteristics. Then in the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine will target the cardiac and other muscles, including smooth muscles of the blood vessels. And it is released in the emergency situations and will raise blood glucose levels, as well as increase heart rate and elevate blood pressure, increase breathing rate, all of that good stuff. Kind of known as the adrenaline response. The pineal gland is pretty simple. It hangs from the roof of the third ventricle in the diencephalon. It's in the epithalamus region above the thalamus, and it secretes melatonin. This causes drowsiness and regulates the circadian rhythm. It also has effects on mood, and in some animals it can influence fertility. In some animals, higher melatonin levels will increase fertility, and in some animals, lower melatonin levels will increase fertility. The diencephalon is pictured here in purple, and it includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus. So this table here summarizes the pineal gland. and it releases melatonin, targets the brain, and controls the circadian and circannual rhythms, and is possibly involved in the maturation of the sex organs, as well in fertility. You may be aware, but it is advised against taking melatonin supplements when on birth control, because it might reduce the effectiveness. Now let's look at reproductive hormones. These include the ovaries, which are located in the pelvic cavity that produce the estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen will regulate secondary sex characteristics such as breast development, pubic hair, etc. And progesterone will help stimulate the uterus to bring about thickening and vascularization of the endometrium, which prepares for the implantation of a fertilized egg. The placenta is a temporary organ only formed during pregnancy, and it produces HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropic hormone. And it has aid in maintaining pregnancy and keeping the corpus luteum intact. The testes are located in the scrotum, and they secrete testosterone, which is the male sex hormone. This brings about the development of secondary sex characteristics, normal sex behaviors, and the production of sperm. The testes also produce inhibin, which inhibits the release of follicle-stimulating hormone, and GnRH when sperm counts are high. The table that summarizes the testes and ovaries. For the testes, androgens such as testosterone are released. They target the gonads, skin, muscles, and bones, and they stimulate male sex characteristics. The ovaries produce estrogens and progesterone, and they target gonads, skin, muscles, and bones, and they stimulate the female sex characteristics. Last but not least is the pancreas. The pancreas is a gland with dual functions. It secretes digestive enzymes into the small intestines, and that's an exocrine function. The endocrine function is when it secretes the two protein hormones known as insulin and glucagon into the blood. Insulin and glucagon are said to be antagonistic hormones because the effects are opposing each other. The balance in secretion of insulin and glucagon maintains a homeostatic set point of glucose. In the pancreas, the alpha cells will secrete glucagon, and the beta cells will secrete insulin. This illustration shows the regulation of blood glucose. You can see the set point here in milligrams per 100 milliliters. Looks like it's hovering around 90. So let's look what happens at 7 a.m. The stimulus is a carbohydrate-rich breakfast. That's an early breakfast. And this causes blood glucose levels to rise, which will stimulate the pancreas. Beta cells of the pancreas will then release insulin. Insulin stimulates cells to take up glucose. The liver and the muscle cells form glycogen stores at the influence of insulin, and then blood glucose levels will decrease. Now let's see what happens at 2 o'clock because, bad, lunch was skipped. So declining blood glucose levels, my blood glucose would have dipped long before 2 p.m. Anyway, but declining blood glucose levels stimulate the pancreas. The pancreas then, the alpha cells, will release glucagon into the blood. Liver cells will then break down glycogen stores and return the glucose to the blood. The muscles are going to hold on to their glucose stores as long as they can. They're not going to give them up for the rest of your body, but the liver cells will. And so as the liver cells give up their glycogen at the behest of glucagon, blood glucose levels will increase and glucose will return to its set point. And this will continue to cycle as blood glucose homeostasis is maintained. Diabetes. Diabetes mellitus is a serious hormonal disorder caused by the body's inability to produce or use insulin, thereby decreasing the absorption of glucose from the blood. The result of diabetes is an elevated blood glucose level or hyperglycemia. In hypoglycemia, the hyperactive beta cells secrete too much insulin into the blood when sugar is eaten. As a result, blood glucose levels can drop well below normal range. The first picture shows normal glucose and insulin levels. The second shows that in type 1 diabetes, insulin is absent. In type 2 diabetes, insulin signaling is defective. So insulin is present, but it cannot bind to the cells anymore. All right, so to recap, the first two that we saw there were insulin and glucagon from the pancreas, and they both target liver, muscles, and the adipose tissue. Insulin lowers blood glucose level and promotes the formation of glycogen, whereas glucagon will raise blood glucose level. And then there's a hormone called somatostatin, and it's going to target the alpha and beta cells of the pancreas, and it inhibits insulin and glucagon, which prevents wide fluctuations in blood glucose. The thymus gland is notable mention here. It is a major part of the immune system and is located posterior to the sternum and between the lungs. It is large in an infant and increases in size until puberty, and then it shrinks as the individual continues to age. The major hormonal product of the thymus gland is thymosin, which appears to be essential for the normal development of T lymphocytes and the immune response. So the table here is for the thymus as the gland, and the hormone is thymosins, and it targets T cells, and it stimulates the production and maturation of T cells. Aging in the endocrine system. As the body ages, changes occur that affect the endocrine system, sometimes altering the production, secretion, and catabolism of hormones. For example, the structure of the anterior pituitary gland changes as vascularization decreases and the connective tissue content increases with increasing age. This restructuring affects the gland's hormone production. Certain hormones and gland production decrease with age, reduce cortisol and aldosterone from the adrenal gland, lower estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries, as well as lower testosterone levels. And that's the end. Thanks for listening.